In this video, we'll be looking at Samyang's 75mm f1.8 autofocus lens for Fujifilm X. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'll be giving you my review of Samyang's new 75mm f1.8 autofocus lens for the Fujifilm X system. Now, it sits right in the middle between Fujifilm's own 56 and 90mm lenses, and so it sort of offers a fast prime where Fujifilm didn't. And I think this is where a lot of the third-party manufacturers are sort of missing out, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, before we get going, the usual disclaimer. Samyang Korea did send me this lens over for review, and I do get to keep it. My agreement with them means that I've provided some sample images from my time with the lens that they can use, and also that they're able to review this video before it goes live to ensure that I haven't made any blatant lies in here, like suggesting that it's an f4 lens, or saying that it's made of solid gold. But aside from that, my opinions here are my own, and Samyang are not able to influence those. One final note, I've actually been testing this lens since the firmware was in beta, and that's been a really interesting process for me. So getting to see how a lens sort of comes together from a fully functioning but slightly rough around the edges mechanical product into a launch-ready final lens has been really interesting on my part. And so if you're interested in that sort of thing, please do hit me up in the comments below, and I will do my best to see if we can convince Samyang's engineers to join me on the channel for a bit of an interview about the process of refining a lens for the Fujifilm X system. Before making this review, I actually fielded questions to my audience here on YouTube, and I got a few things that I will try to address as we go through this review. So to those of you who participated in that, thank you very much for jumping in. But for now, let's get on to the lens. The 75mm focal length on APS-C, for those who love to convert formats, is roughly equivalent to a 110mm lens on 35mm full frame. Now, this puts it right in between Fujifilm's two fast prime offerings and gives us another sort of medium to long option. And we'll chat a little bit more about where this fits in my bag when we get to the in the field section later in the video. But this is where I feel like Samyang is doing, a great job of putting lenses out. So many third-party offerings are just a cheaper or lower quality version of what Fujifilm is already offering, and Samyang has launched the 12mm f2 and now this 75mm f1.8 so far, and both of these are things that Fujifilm doesn't offer at this time, and for me this is a lot more interesting than yet another 23mm f1.4. But back to this lens. Now, the lens body is made from lightweight materials that feel solid in the hand, and it has 10 elements in 9 groups with 2 HR and 3 ED elements for those who love to study the design of their lenses. The autofocus is driven by a stepping motor that, as we will see, really delivers the goods. And not only that, but the minimum focus distance is 69 centimeters, so you can get quite close, but not quite as close as Fujifilm's new XF 56mm. It's still plenty close enough for portraiture and other close-up work though. The most surprising thing about this lens, though, is the weight. Its quoted weight is just 257 grams, making it around half the weight of Fujifilm's own XF 56mm f1.2 WR, and only marginally heavier than the 50mm f2. So honestly, it's almost like not having a lens on the body, even with the really lightweight X-T5, which is really incredible for a fast prime like this. Let's get into the meat of this lens. Now, thanks to Fujifilm's opening of the mount protocol for the X system, there are several sort of offerings coming out from different third-party lens manufacturers with autofocus for the X series cameras now. Now, this is actually Samyang's second offering after their 12mm f2 that I reviewed a while back, and much like that lens, this lens offers quite fast and accurate focus through a stepping motor. Now, while it's not the linear motors that we see in some of Fujifilm's flagship lenses, the motor does get the job done very well, and in some cases I actually found it to be a little bit better than Fujifilm's own offerings, and we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. Now, this lens interfaces with all of Fujifilm's AF systems, so you get access to all the different modes like object detection, face detection, focus bracketing, that sort of thing, and in that sense you won't really notice a difference between it and anything that Fujifilm offers. Let's start with my most commonly used focus method, single point in AFS. Now, this is where I spend most of my time, as I don't really need to track a lot of moving objects for the majority of my work. And the 75mm focuses quickly and confidently in pretty much any light. Now, as we expect from a stepping motor, there's very little hesitation, there's very little hunting, it just sort of zips into place. Now, from time to time, in really, really low contrast light, or when it gets very dark, it will pulse back and forth a little, but Fujifilm's lenses do exactly the same thing, so we'll just chalk that up to the X-T5's autofocus system rather than the lens itself. Now, AFS is actually an area where the lens improved significantly over the development process, and when I received my first lens, there were some quirks with the AFS that meant it struggled or missed from time to time, and I was able to share the details of those situations with the engineers at Samyang, and within a few days the issues were gone and the lens focused with no problems at all. Next up, let's talk tracking and AFC. Now, while I don't use this functionality all that much in my own photography, I did want to stress test the lens on my X-T5 by taking it out to our local cycling paths here in Seoul and tracking some of the cyclists as they sort of barreled down the path. And honestly, after using some of Fujifilm's stepping motor lenses, I expected perhaps, an 80% hit rate from this lens. And I was absolutely blown away when I got back to find that every single frame at f1.8 was in perfect focus. Now, I was so surprised that I went out and did the tests again just to see if it wasn't some sort of anomaly, but I came back with another set of perfectly in focus images. Now, that is impressive as far as I'm concerned, and tracking definitely performs really, really well on this lens. When I first took this lens out of the box, I was surprised at the size of the rear element. Now, compared to a lot of Fujifilm's primes, it was quite large, and that gave me my first clue as to the lens design. And then I took it out into the real world, did a couple of quick sharpness and chromatic aberration tests, and I found that it performed really well from corner to corner. And not only that, but there was very, very little vignette present. So I guess suspicion confirmed. This had to be a lens design with a much larger image circle than was actually being used on the APS-C sensor of the X-T5. And what that means for us as photographers is sort of better performance in the corners of the image, because we're not going to be using the far edges of the image circle. So let's look at a few samples. In my experience with this lens, I've found it to be sharp across the frame from corner to corner, and it does quite a good job of rendering detail both close to the camera and far away. Now, when we consider this lens in a vacuum, I'd be more than happy to use it for couple sessions and corporate events, things like that. And in a way, I'd compare the sharpness to lenses like Fujifilm's first XF56mm f1.2 or the XF35mm f1.4. It's plenty sharp, but it's not crazy sharp like Sigma's art primes or some of the new fast primes from Fujifilm. Now, there's a little of that sort of glowing to be found around super high contrast edges, and nothing that would ruin an image, but it can give the impression that the lens isn't rendering quite as much detail as some of the other lenses you might see. When we compare it directly to some of Fujifilm's finer lenses, like the XF56mm f1.2 RWR or the XF90mm f2, we can see that it's not quite as sharp as those lenses when all are used wide open. Now, the 90mm tends to be the sharpest and the most contrasty in my experience, followed by the 56mm WR, and then by the 75mm from Samyang. But once we stop down to around f4, the 75mm catches up significantly, and the images are almost indistinguishable in terms of sharpness between those three lenses. Now, the 75mm also does an excellent job with corner sharpness, which is presumably contributed to by the larger image circle that it produces. Now, essentially with an APS-C sensor, we're only going to be seeing the central area of that image circle, so we can get the best of what this lens has to offer. Chromatic aberration is also reasonably well controlled for a fast aperture lens. Now, in most normal situations, you're not really going to see any at all, but when it comes to scenes like this one, where the difference around the out of focus edges is 5 or 6 stops of light, you can see a little fringing begin to appear. Now, it can also be seen in the lines around sort of bokeh balls and things like that, which reminds me a little bit of the way that Fujifilm's XF35mm f1.4 displayed its CA. Even with the larger image circle that this lens projects, we would expect to see a little bit of vignetting when the lens is used wide open, and that's certainly the case here. Now, at f1.8, it seems to be around a half-stop darkening that softly fades into the center of the frame, and this significantly improves by f2 and is almost gone by f2.8, so really nothing to worry about there. One of the questions that I was asked when I posted about this lens in my community page was to comment on the color shift when compared to some of Fujifilm's lenses. Now, for those not familiar, each lens design basically shifts the color in your images ever so slightly. Now, on something like slide film, this could be a real concern. However, with digital, we can typically fix most color shifts in post-production, and it's generally pretty easy to do as long as the shift isn't too significant. Now, in my testing, the 75mm falls somewhere between the warmth of Fujifilm's XF56mm and the 90mm. So there's only a few hundred Kelvin separating those lenses in terms of color, so it's not going to be a huge issue for most work. With any fast aperture lens, we are going to talk about bokeh quality at some point. Now, of course, this is going to be a very subjective subject, so I'm not going to try and tell you that the bokeh is good or bad. What I would like to do is first show you a few examples so that you can start to decide for yourself how you feel about it, whether this bokeh is pleasing to your eye. And then I'll show you some side-by-side shots from the Fujifilm XF56mm, 90mm, to give you an idea of how some of the lenses from Fujifilm compare to this, so that you can make your own decisions about the bokeh. The next couple of images are side-by-side comparisons of the same subject from my garden. Now, I did my best to match the size of the subject in the frame so that we could compare the results, because that's how we use lenses in the real world. Now, they were also shot wide open to ensure that when we compare, we're looking at the best that each lens can provide. So first, looking at the 75mm side-by-side with the 56mm RWR. Now, to my eye, the 56mm produces a slightly smoother background with less discernible details, and that's been my experience when working in the real world with, say, human subjects as well. So if I really want that buttery smooth background, I'm definitely going to reach for the 56mm lens for that. Next, the 75mm and the 90mm side by side. Now, these two, to my eye, are far more similar. Perhaps there's a touch more softness from the 90mm, but I would rate them as being almost interchangeable for creating bokeh like this. If you're looking to get some nice sun stars in the background of a portrait, or maybe from the streetlights in a cityscape, you can definitely achieve those with this lens. Now, they begin to appear right from f2, and by 5.6 they're starting to become large and defined. I did notice that at certain angles, a hazy flare can occur across the frame in bright sunlight. Now, a good example of that would be this market scene from Busan. Now, the sun is just outside the top right corner of this image, and as you can see, it results in a bit of contrast loss all the way across the frame. Now, since I didn't have the hood with me, I shaded the lens with my hand for the next shot, and I was able to regain all of that contrast very easily. As for ghosting, there's definitely some when bright lights are in or around the frame, but it's nothing particularly interesting like we've seen from some of Laowa lenses. It's just the kind that we see from a lot of modern lenses, and it can be avoided by changing your angle slightly and sort of sending the artifacts out of the frame. One of the best things about reviewing a lens, especially a prime, is forcing yourself to work with it in a lot of different situations. Now, when I first received this lens, it was before our work season here got started, and I was really only able to use it for some travel, maybe some landscape and some street work. And then as the season picked up, I was able to use it in corporate events and couple sessions, and also with a couple of studio portraits. So this swatch of different work has really given me a look into, what this lens is actually useful for. Another question that I got from a viewer was, where does this lens fit in my bag? Now, not physically, of course, because it's quite small, but what would make me reach for it over the 56mm or the 90mm focal lengths? And I think that that's a really great way to start this section of the review, because all three of these lenses could fill a similar role in your photography, but they each have sort of unique strengths. The most important reasons that I might reach for this lens over one of the others would be because of its working distance and the field of view that it provides. Now, there are some scenes where, arranging the elements the way that you want them takes being in a very specific place, and there's always a focal length that achieves the look that you want from that particular spot in space. Now, there are also times where the field of view might be, just right for removing the distractions in a scene, and a good example of that would be with portraits. When working with this lens in the studio for a portrait, I found it quite useful for shots of sort of the bust and up. Now, it allowed us to work in relatively small sections of the studio because of the narrow field of view, and I could cut out a lot of the clutter very easily. But it required a little bit more working distance than we had to get a full-length portrait. So for full-length portrait work, I would say that this is much more suited to sort of outdoor portraits. For outdoor portraits, this is a much more flexible focal length, as you've generally got a little bit more freedom to move around. Now, I can see it being quite useful for couple portraits at, say, a wedding or an engagement session, especially when you really need to keep background distractions to a minimum with your field of view, and also work with shallow depth of field at the same time. The next reason I would take this lens is when I think that I might want to use both the 56 and the 90mm focal lengths, but I really don't want to carry the extra weight, and I could get away with something in between. Now, for example, that might be on a cycling trip where I really want to minimize weight, or when I know that I'll be photographing predominantly, speakers on a stand at a corporate event, and I can get away with a single focal length. And being so compact and light, this lens has been a really good companion for times like that. The third situation would be when I need to track a fast-moving subject. Now, for the beauty of the 56mm rendering, it still can't track very well because of its DC coreless motor, and as for the 90mm, it tracks quite well, but I honestly think that the Samyang outdoes it in a lot of situations. The final one would be when I want a little bit more of an old school rendering. Now, I'm acutely aware of the fact that that means very little and is very subjective, but there's, a slightly lower contrast look and a slightly rougher bokeh that comes from the 75mm that can just work for some certain scenes. Now, everything that the 56mm touches just turns to butter and melts away, but this lens gives a little bit more character to the bokeh. This very simple photograph of a dead leaf from a favorite cafe of mine is a really good example of this. Now, it's a very subtle difference, but the 75mm produces a slightly more coarse bokeh that somehow feels a little bit noisier, for want of a better word, than the 56mm. One type of photography that I really enjoyed using this lens for was actually street photography. Now, that's because of its ability to sort of pick out parts of a scene and also stay a little bit further back from my subject. Now, it allowed for very different compositions than what I might normally get from more traditional street photography focal lengths like 23mm or 35mm. And with that working distance required, occasionally things would sort of get in the way, but I was still able to come away with a lot of photographs that I was happy with this lens. So while it might not quite be the all-rounder for street work that a 23 or a 33mm lens is, there are definitely some compositions to be made with this focal length in a lot of different situations that can produce really unique looks for street photography. So please do stick around to the end of the video for the slideshow to see a few more examples of this. Okay, so here we are filming me on the 75mm lens. Now, video really isn't my place, so I wanted to share a quick clip like this with you just to give you an idea of how it performs. And what I hope that you'll see is just how effective these stepping motors are at tracking my face. And I guess I'll find out how effective they are in a few minutes when I review this footage. Now, the other thing that Samyang mentioned with relation to video was that the aperture can actually be decoupled from the body and reassigned to the focus ring on the lens for very smooth transitions in depth of field. Now, this can be done by flipping the custom function switch on the side of the lens, and in the end, I guess it could be used for very smooth exposure transitions when you're working in video, rather than the clicks you might get from using the command dials. So, with the 75mm, we have a solid offering at an attractive price point from Samyang. Now, autofocus is very good, especially when we start tracking moving subjects. The image quality is also very good. It renders decent detail all the way across the frame and has very low CA. Now, the bokeh might not be quite as smooth as some of the other long primes, but it's definitely not something to turn your nose up at. And the focal length fits squarely between Fujifilm's two 56 and 90mm offerings, and basically brings something to the market that is fairly unique. But who is it actually for? A long focal length prime is certainly not something that everybody is going to want, but if you're comfortable with that sort of narrow field of view and the fast aperture, there are definitely good images to be made with it. Now, personally, I'm going to continue to take it along on my couple sessions and my corporate events. It's served me really well in those situations so far, and I think it's also going to find a way into my bag for my cycling trips. Now, it's a great partner for my 16mm f2.8 and my 35mm f2. It gives me a 3-lens setup that weighs basically nothing and covers a lot of ground with really, really fast apertures. Now, that's a very versatile setup to be able to carry for almost no weight. So in short, it's a very versatile, fast, long lens that gets very close to Fujifilm's lenses in terms of quality, but at a fraction of the price essentially. And it's certainly going to be worth considering if you're looking for a long, fast prime. Now, as always, I hope that you got what you came for from this review, but if there is anything else that you think I may have missed or that you want to perhaps ask me about this lens, please do leave it in the comments below, and I will do my best to provide a helpful answer. Now, while you're down there, please do leave a thumbs up and do subscribe for more videos like this. Enjoy the slideshow. Thanks again.